One narrow stretch of water helps power the modern world. Not a continent, not a superpower, not even a major city. Just a thin passage between Iran and Oman. And yet, when that passage is threatened, oil prices jump, global markets panic, and governments across the world start making emergency plans. Because this is not just another shipping route, it is the Strait of Hormuz, the most dangerous choke point on Earth. A corridor so important that around 1/5 of the world's oil and LNG normally passes through it. Now, as the war involving Iran, the United States, and Israel pushes the region deeper into crisis, the Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a strategic concept on a map. It is a live pressure point. Tanker traffic has plunged. Oil exports have been disrupted. Some ships are still getting through, while others are not. And that has turned this narrow waterway into one of the most important battlegrounds in the global economy. So why is this strait so important? Why is it called a choke point? And why does a conflict in this one corner of the world have the power to send shockwaves across the entire planet? This is Raven Briefing. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. To the north is Iran. To the south are Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Every day, oil and gas from countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and Iran itself move toward this narrow passage before heading out to the Arabian Sea and the wider world. Reuters reports the route normally carries about 20% of global oil and LNG supply. That is why Hormuz is not just a regional waterway, it is a global energy artery. If this route remains stable, the world barely notices it. But when it is threatened, the entire system feels the pressure. Because modern economies do not just run on oil, they run on reliable oil flows. And few places are more important to those flows than the Strait of Hormuz. Reuters says even emergency responses now include stockpile releases from the International Energy Agency because of the disruption tied to this crisis. A choke point is exactly what it sounds like. A narrow route that carries something the world cannot easily do without. In the case of Hormuz, that something is energy. The danger is not just that so much oil passes through it. The real danger is that there are limits to how much can be rerouted around it. Gulf countries have built pipelines to reduce dependence on the strait. But Reuters reports that even with alternatives, the region still cannot fully replace the lost flow when Hormuz is badly disrupted. In the current crisis, regional output cuts have been estimated at roughly 7 to 10 million barrels per day, with the UAE alone seeing output fall by more than half. That is what makes a choke point so powerful. It is not simply important, it is hard to replace. And when something that critical becomes vulnerable, every threat becomes bigger than the local conflict itself. It becomes a global problem. The countries that rely most heavily on Hormuz are not all in the Middle East. Many are in Asia. Reuters reports that China is one of the biggest countries affected by what happens here, and US officials have explicitly pointed to China's dependence on energy moving through the strait. India, too, has been directly involved in talks and shipments linked to the route during this crisis. Pakistan has also managed at least one openly signaled tanker transit through the strait. This matters because the Strait of Hormuz is not only about fuel for cars or jets. It shapes shipping costs, industrial production, inflation, electricity prices, and the cost of goods around the world. Reuters reported Brent crude moving above $100 a barrel during the crisis, while governments considered reserve releases to calm markets. In other words, when Hormuz shakes, the world pays. Iran does not need to conquer a navy to create chaos in the strait. It just needs to make the route dangerous enough that ships hesitate, insurers raise prices, and energy markets panic. According to Reuters, Iran has effectively disrupted the route through attacks, threats, and broader military pressure tied to the war. The result is not always a perfect physical blockade. In practice, it can be something more complex, and in some ways more powerful. A selective disruption. Enough danger to choke the route, without necessarily sealing it shut for every vessel. That is exactly what makes the current situation so important. Because the story right now is not simply that Hormuz is open, and it is not simply that Hormuz is closed. The story is that access itself has become political. As of now, Reuters reports that the United States is effectively tolerating some ships getting through the strait, including Iranian, Indian, and Chinese-linked fuel shipments, because allowing at least some movement helps keep the world supplied. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said Washington is fine with some ships passing for now. That single detail changes how this crisis should be understood. Hormuz is no longer just a route under threat. It is becoming a filter. Some ships move, others wait. Some countries negotiate, others hesitate. And every decision sends a message about power, risk, and influence. Reuters also reports that allies have been reluctant to join a US-led military effort to secure the strait. Germany, Spain, and Italy have ruled out involvement, while others have been cautious and focused on de-escalation. Britain has signaled willingness to discuss a broader coalition, but not to be dragged into a wider war. So the crisis in Hormuz is not just about shipping. It is also about coalition politics. Who will act? Who will wait? And who will try to benefit from the chaos without being pulled fully into the conflict? When people hear about a waterway in the Gulf, it can sound distant, regional, technical. But Hormuz is none of those things. If enough oil is delayed, energy prices rise. When energy prices rise, transportation costs rise. Manufacturing costs rise. Food distribution becomes more expensive. Airlines pay more. Consumers pay more. Governments face pressure. Central banks face pressure. And suddenly, a military escalation thousands of miles away becomes part of daily life almost everywhere. Reuters reports the current disruption has already forced production shut-ins across major producers and pushed the IEA to coordinate a major emergency stockpile release. And there is another layer to this. The Strait of Hormuz does not only reveal military vulnerability, it reveals economic vulnerability. It shows how much of the world still depends on a few critical maritime routes, and how quickly those routes can become weapons in a larger struggle for leverage. That is why this is one of the most dangerous choke points on Earth. Not because it is always closed, but because the threat of disruption alone can move markets, reshape diplomacy, and raise the cost of instability for the entire world. Reuters reporting on plunging traffic, selective passage, and emergency planning underscores exactly that point. The current war has made one thing clear. The world is not just watching missiles, it is watching maps. Because geography still matters. A narrow passage between Iran and Oman has become one of the biggest tests of global energy security. The United States wants countries that depend on Gulf oil to help secure it. China has every reason to care about what moves through it. India is trying to protect supply. Europe wants maritime freedom restored, but without deepening the war. France has publicly called for navigation to be restored, while other allies remain cautious about military involvement. And Iran understands that this choke point gives it leverage far beyond its borders. That is the real lesson of Hormuz. In a world built on trade, supply chains, and energy dependence, power is not only measured by armies or air forces. Sometimes, it is measured by control over a narrow strip of water. The Strait of Hormuz is called a choke point because so much of the world depends on it, and because there is no easy way around it. Around 1/5 of global oil and LNG normally moves through this route. In the current war, tanker traffic has plunged. Some ships are still being allowed through, and major producers have already suffered real supply losses. That is why this waterway matters so much. It is not just a line on a map. It is a pressure valve for the global economy, a strategic fault line between war and trade, and a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous places in the world are not the biggest, but the narrowest. This has been Raven Briefing.